I was sitting in my office late on a Thursday night when the email arrived. No subject line, just a single sentence. You are no longer needed. Effective immediately. That was it. 17 years of service reduced to 10 words on a screen. No meeting, no handshake, no explanation. Just digital exile delivered while a billion-dollar merger was hours from closing. I stared at the message, my fingers hovering above the keyboard. I could have replied with questions. I could have demanded a reason. Instead, I typed 2 words, I understand. Then I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair. Outwardly calm, inwardly cold. Because while they thought they were erasing me, they had no idea what I had saved. My name is Michael Grant, 52 years old. For almost 2 decades, I worked as senior compliance officer at Harmonix Capital, a private equity firm in New York. Not glamorous, not flashy, but essential. I was the one who checked the fine print, the one who knew every regulatory line by heart. I had watched deals rise and collapse. I had seen partners walk away with fortunes and others crawl out in disgrace. My role was simple: protect the firm from itself. And now, on the eve of its biggest deal, a $1 billion merger with a healthcare giant, they had decided I was expendable. I didn't storm down the hallway. I didn't call the CEO. I didn't even tell my wife when I got home that night. Instead, I poured myself a drink, sat in the dark, and thought about the files I had been quietly keeping. Backups, notes, draft contracts with red flags circled in the margins, copies of correspondence that revealed things the executives preferred buried. They had forgotten who handled the details. I hadn't. The next morning, I packed my office into a single cardboard box. My team avoided my eyes. No one asked questions. They had probably heard the same rumor. Michael was too rigid, too cautious, too unwilling to play along with the aggressive strategies the CEO demanded. That was fine. Let them believe it. As I walked out of the building for the last time, I thought about the irony. The merger depended on documents I had reviewed personally. They were spotless only because I had caught every flaw. Without me, those flaws would resurface. And when they did, the cracks would spread through the entire deal. That weekend, I sat at my dining room table with the files laid out in front of me. Hundreds of pages. Emails, contracts, compliance checklists. Each one told a piece of the same story. The deal wasn't as clean as the executives claimed. They knew it. They ignored it. And now, without me to shield them, those hidden fractures would become public. I poured another drink, my hands steady. They thought firing me was the end. But they had fired me too late. 3 weeks from now, in a boardroom full of investors, regulators, and journalists, the billion-dollar merger would collapse. And I wouldn't have to raise my voice once. The first weekend after I was fired, I barely left my study. While the city outside pulsed with Friday night noise, I sat in silence, the glow of my desk lamp stretching across rows of folders. Years of careful documentation, each note precise, each email archived. I had always been methodical, quiet, the kind of man who left no loose ends. That habit had just become my advantage. The CEO, Richard Cole, had sent the email. A man who measured success by headlines and bonus packages, not by sustainability. He liked speed, aggression, deals that made the front page. To him, I was an obstacle. Too many questions, too many delays. But the truth was, my questions were the only reason Harmonix Capital hadn't collapsed years earlier. I had shielded him from regulators more times than he even realized. Now he had cut that shield away. Saturday morning, I opened my encrypted drive. Inside were draft contracts from the merger, the ones Cole and his inner circle had rushed through. I scrolled through redlined sections I had flagged. Undisclosed liabilities, questionable revenue projections, conflicts of interest disguised as consulting fees. Each one ignored. Each one a landmine waiting to detonate. I leaned back, sipping black coffee gone cold. They believed they could silence me by removing me. What they didn't realize was that silence could be louder than protest. My absence from the deal would speak for itself. The fractures would widen, because no one else knew where they were. That evening, Andrea asked if I was okay. I told her only that changes were coming. She didn't push. She had seen me like this before. Focused, calculating, stripped of emotion. She knew better than to mistake quiet for defeat. By Sunday, I had built a timeline. Every questionable clause, every buried risk, every irregular email was mapped to dates and signatures. The picture was clear. This merger wasn't clean. It was a house of cards. And Richard Cole had bet everything, his reputation, his future, his firm, on no one noticing until it was too late. On Monday morning, I drafted a message. Not to Harmonix, not to Cole, but to the regulators who oversaw billion-dollar mergers. The message was simple, anonymous, and impossible to ignore. It included just enough documentation to raise eyebrows and force deeper scrutiny. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't rant. I simply pointed out facts, underlined with precision, and signed it with silence. By noon, I received the first confirmation. The documents had been received. No reply beyond that. No indication of action. But I knew the process. I had been in compliance long enough to recognize the rhythm of investigation. Once regulators smelled smoke, they never ignored the possibility of fire. I shut down my computer and walked away from the desk. My part was done. Now it was only a matter of time. Richard Cole believed he had fired a man with no leverage. What he didn't know was that I had placed a match at the base of his billion-dollar tower. And soon, everyone would watch it fall. By Tuesday morning, I knew the first domino had fallen. A contact of mine, someone buried deep in the regulatory offices, left me a short voicemail. No names, no details, just 5 words. Your documents are being reviewed. That was all I needed. Once scrutiny began, it could not be stopped. Meanwhile, Harmonix Capital was parading the merger in the press. Richard Cole gave interviews, smiling with perfect confidence, telling investors that this was the deal of the decade. His face was everywhere, magazines, financial networks, even the morning shows. To the world, he looked untouchable. To me, he looked exposed. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I simply sat in my study and kept reviewing. Every time I opened another folder, the same truth repeated itself. They had built this merger on lies. And I had the receipts. That afternoon, I began to notice something interesting. Calls from unknown numbers. Emails from Harmonix accounts that I hadn't heard from since my termination. Some asked for clarifications. Others suggested meeting off the record. I ignored them all. My silence was not negotiable. I wasn't going to help patch their cracks. I wanted those cracks to widen. By Wednesday, the first reports leaked. A financial blog hinted that regulators had concerns about the structure of the merger. The article was vague, speculative, but enough to stir doubt. I watched Harmonix's stock price dip 2%. Nothing catastrophic, yet. Just the market sniffing uncertainty. Cole dismissed it in another interview, calling it typical noise. But I knew better. Noise becomes thunder when the storm is real. That night, Andrea found me sitting in the dark again. She asked if I was angry. I told her no. Anger fades too quickly. What I felt was colder, sharper, focus. I wasn't out to shout or destroy. I was out to let truth surface. And truth has a way of suffocating lies without effort. By Thursday, my silence began to unsettle them. A former colleague called from a blocked number. His voice shook as he said the firm was in chaos. Meetings stretched past midnight. Lawyers combed through documents, trying to explain away things I had flagged months earlier. They were panicking. He said Cole demanded to know if I had spoken to anyone. He wanted to believe I was bitter but harmless. He was wrong. I ended the call without comment. The less I said, the more dangerous I became in their eyes. Silence forced them to imagine what I might know, what I might do. That fear was more powerful than any threat I could deliver. By Friday, I had confirmation. Regulators had opened a formal inquiry. The billion-dollar merger was no longer on autopilot. Every hidden liability, every doctored projection, every conflict of interest would be dragged into the light. I poured myself a drink, calm and steady. The process had begun, and there was no reversing it. Richard Cole thought he had silenced me with an email. What he didn't understand was that silence had become my weapon, and now it was cutting through everything he built. By the second week, the pressure inside Harmonix Capital was visible from the outside. Financial journalists sharpened their headlines. Investors whispered behind closed doors. Every minor hiccup in the merger process became amplified, dissected, magnified. What had been presented as unstoppable now looked vulnerable. I followed it all from a distance. I didn't speak to reporters. I didn't leak anything beyond what I had already sent. I just watched the storm gather. Silence allowed me to see things others missed, the tremors before the quake. One morning, Andrea slid a newspaper across the table at breakfast. The front page showed Richard Cole stepping out of a black car, jaw tight, eyes narrowed. The headline read, Regulators raise questions over $1 billion merger. Beneath it, speculation that Harmonix had failed to disclose certain liabilities. The article mentioned subpoenas. That word alone was enough to make investors sweat. By midday, Harmonix's stock dropped 7%. Not fatal, but enough to rattle confidence. I imagined the boardroom, directors staring daggers at Cole while he promised everything was under control. The truth was slipping, and he couldn't stop it. That afternoon, I received another call from a former colleague. His voice was hushed, urgent. He said the office felt like a bunker. Cole was shouting, lawyers were scrambling, and employees were ordered not to speak to anyone outside. My name came up again and again, he said. They were convinced I had orchestrated this. I let him talk. Then I ended the call without a word. The less I said, the more weight the silence carried. By Thursday, the merger partner, the healthcare giant, released a cautious statement. They remained committed, but were monitoring the situation closely. I knew what that meant. They were preparing an escape hatch, ready to withdraw the second regulators uncovered something concrete. Deals collapsed not because of certainty, but because of doubt, and I had planted enough seeds to grow a forest. That night, I walked alone through the city. Lights reflected off glass towers, each one filled with men like Richard Cole, confident, ruthless, convinced they were invincible. I thought about the years I had spent protecting men like him, fixing their mistakes, shielding them from consequences. My silence back then had been loyalty. Now it was justice. By Friday morning, the collapse had begun. The healthcare partner announced a temporary pause on the merger until regulatory concerns were resolved. The statement was polite, but the market knew the truth. Billion-dollar deals don't pause. They either close or they die. Harmonix stock plummeted 12% in a single day. Investors demanded answers. Cole tried to stand tall, but the cracks in his empire were widening faster than he could patch them. I sat at my desk, calm and still, reading every line of every article. They didn't know I had been the one to set this in motion. They didn't know the silence behind the storm. And that ignorance was the sweetest part. The deal wasn't dead yet, but I could already hear the walls groaning. It was only a matter of time before everything came down. By the third week, the silence around me grew heavier, but inside Harmonix, the noise was deafening. Newspapers printed daily updates, television anchors speculated about hidden scandals, and analysts on Wall Street began downgrading the firm. What had started as whispers was now a storm battering the glass walls of Richard Cole's empire. I didn't move fast. I didn't need to. My work had already been done before they even realized I was gone. Each day I checked the markets, read the filings, and waited for the pressure to mount. Waiting was my weapon. On Monday morning, the healthcare partner CEO was photographed leaving a closed-door meeting with regulators. The image hit every business site within an hour. His face looked strained, guarded. By noon, speculation spread that the partner was reconsidering its involvement. Harmonix stock lost another 5% before the markets closed. That evening, Andrea asked me if I planned to step back in, to give an interview, to tell my side. I shook my head. My silence was more destructive than any words I could speak. Once the truth was set free, it didn't need me to explain it. On Tuesday, I received a letter delivered by courier. No return address, but I knew immediately it came from Harmonix. Inside was an offer, enhanced severance, legal immunity, and a non-disclosure agreement. The message between the lines was clear. They were afraid of what else I might reveal. I folded the letter once and dropped it into the trash. Wednesday brought confirmation that regulators had escalated the inquiry. Subpoenas were issued, not just to Harmonix, but to the merger partner as well. That detail mattered. Once both sides were pulled in, the merger timeline became impossible. Billion-dollar deals don't survive uncertainty. The cracks were spreading faster now, and investors were watching every fracture. By Thursday, Richard Cole himself appeared on television again, trying to project calm. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed him. He repeated the same phrases: no wrongdoing, full transparency, business as usual. But I recognized the panic beneath his tone. I had sat in too many boardrooms not to hear it. He wasn't reassuring the market. He was pleading with it. That night, I sat at my desk, scrolling through old emails I had archived. I found one from Cole, written months earlier. In it, he dismissed my concerns about hidden liabilities with a single sentence: compliance is your obsession, not mine. I saved it again, this time in a folder labeled Final. By Friday, the partner announced it was formally evaluating alternatives. The polite language couldn't mask the truth. They were preparing to walk. Investors reacted instantly. Harmonix stock fell another 15%. Cole's billion-dollar triumph was turning into a public humiliation. I leaned back in my chair, calm, steady. The silence I had kept since that first email firing me was no longer just mine. It had become theirs, an empty void where confidence used to be. And soon, that silence would echo in the only place Cole feared most, the boardroom. The boardroom cracks appeared faster than the market once. I didn't need insider whispers to know it. The patterns were obvious. Directors who once stood firmly behind Richard Cole began to distance themselves in public. Their names stopped appearing beside his in press releases. Their silence told me everything. On Monday, a leaked memo surfaced online. It revealed internal disagreements within Harmonix leadership about the merger. The language was vague, carefully written, but it showed division at the highest levels. Investors don't forgive division. Within hours, shares dropped another 10%. That evening, Andrea found me in the living room, a stack of newspapers at my side. She asked if I felt vindicated. I told her no. Vindication implies anger. What I felt was colder, confirmation. Cole had always believed noise was power. He filled boardrooms with his voice, interviews with his confidence. Now, silence was eating him alive. By Wednesday, regulators issued a formal delay of the merger review. That word, delay, was a death sentence. Deals of that size depended on momentum. Every week of uncertainty bled money. Both Harmonix and its partner watched millions vanish as their stock slid further. Cole gave another interview, insisting the merger would proceed. His smile was tight, his tone forced. I could see the sweat behind the suit. On Thursday, I received another envelope by courier. This time, it wasn't an offer. It was a threat. Legal language filled the pages, accusing me of defamation, breach of confidentiality, interference. But I knew the law better than they realized. Nothing I had shared was false. Nothing I had done violated the agreements I had signed. It was noise, nothing more. I placed the letter in the same drawer as the severance offer, unbothered. Meanwhile, whispers grew louder. Analysts openly questioned whether Harmonix could survive if the merger collapsed. Reports highlighted their fragile finances, the debt they carried, the risky bets Cole had made to force growth. Without the merger, the company wasn't stable. Investors were beginning to realize it. By Friday, the partner made its move. They announced an official withdrawal from the merger, citing regulatory uncertainty. Polite, polished words, but everyone understood the truth. They had seen the rot and wanted no part of it. The billion-dollar deal was dead. Harmonix stock fell 30% in a single day. News anchors replayed Cole's past interviews, contrasting his confidence with the collapse. The same man who had fired me by email was now on every screen, his empire crumbling around him. I didn't cheer. I didn't call anyone. I simply closed the paper, walked to the window, and looked out at the city. 3 weeks earlier, Cole thought he had silenced me. Now, silence had destroyed him. And the echo of that collapse was only beginning to spread. The collapse of the merger sent shockwaves far beyond Harmonix capital. By Monday morning, television anchors called it the deal that disintegrated. Analysts dissected every stage of the failure, each one pointing to weaknesses Richard Cole had brushed aside. They asked how a billion-dollar transaction could fall apart so quickly, how so many liabilities had been missed. They didn't realize nothing had been missed. I had flagged everything. Cole had simply chosen to bury it. I watched the coverage with detached calm. My name was never mentioned. I wasn't the story. The story was the arrogance of a CEO who believed he could silence compliance and still survive. But I knew the truth. It wasn't regulators or journalists who had destroyed him. It was silence. Mine. By Tuesday, Harmonix's board called an emergency meeting. Leaked reports said directors were furious, demanding accountability. Investors wanted blood. Cole tried to shield himself, but boards don't forgive failure of this magnitude. Not when billions evaporate and reputations burn. That night, Andrea asked me what I thought would happen next. I told her it was simple. First, Cole would try to cling to power. Then, when the pressure became unbearable, the board would push him out. Silence has a way of isolating men like him. Once their voices lose power, they stand alone. By Wednesday, the predictions came true. Cole appeared at a press conference, attempting to frame the collapse as temporary, A setback, not an end. But his voice cracked. The man who once filled rooms with confidence now looked small, cornered. Reporters pressed him with questions he couldn't answer. Why hadn't liabilities been disclosed? Why had compliance concerns been ignored? He stumbled, offering phrases like miscommunication and timing issues. The market punished him immediately. Shares dropped another 20%. On Thursday, the board made its move. They announced Cole had resigned to pursue other opportunities. Everyone knew it wasn't resignation, it was exile. Directors lined up to reassure investors that Harmonix would recover, but their eyes told the truth. The firm had been gutted. The billion-dollar dream had become a cautionary tale. I sat at my desk that evening, the letter from Cole still saved in my email. You are no longer needed. 10 words meant to erase me. 10 words that now echoed back at him, louder than any headline. Andrea joined me, resting a hand on my shoulder. She asked if I felt finished. I thought about it, staring at the city lights outside. Harmonix was crumbling. Cole had fallen, and the deal was ash. But was I finished? Not yet. Because silence had carried me this far, but there was one final act left. The collapse wasn't complete until the truth was undeniable. Until the world understood how arrogance had blinded them. And I was the only one who could show them. The week after Cole's resignation, Harmonix tried to steady itself. The board appointed an interim CEO, a woman named Karen Ellis. She stood in front of cameras and promised stability, transparency, and reform. But no matter how carefully she spoke, investors heard only one thing: fear. The firm had lost its anchor deal, its stock had collapsed, and its credibility was shattered. I could have walked away then. I had already watched the empire burn from a distance. But something inside me refused to leave it unfinished. Cole's fall was public, but the truth behind it, the arrogance, the greed, the deliberate blindness, still hid in shadows. They had fired me in silence. I wanted silence to finish them completely, so I prepared the final act. Over 17 years, I had collected documents, not because I planned revenge, but because I never trusted shortcuts. Emails, drafts, compliance reports. Each one carefully labeled, encrypted, and stored away. Now those records became a weapon sharper than anything Cole had feared. On Monday morning, I drafted a report. Not an opinion, not an accusation, but a timeline. Dates, signatures, flagged risks ignored. Every moment where Cole had been warned. Every time executives had chosen profit over compliance. No anger in my words, no flourish. Just facts, lined up like dominoes. By Wednesday, the report was finished. I printed a hard copy, sealed it in an envelope, and sent it anonymously to 3 places: the financial regulators, the investigative journalists who had followed the collapse most closely, and the Harmonix board itself. I didn't attach my name. I didn't need to. The documents spoke louder than I ever could. On Thursday, the first article broke. A well-known financial paper published excerpts from the report, highlighting emails where Cole dismissed compliance concerns, highlighting contracts I had flagged months before. The article stopped short of naming me, but between the lines, insiders would know exactly whose fingerprints were on those documents. By Friday, the storm had grown. Cable news ran segments every hour. Analysts debated how Harmonix could have ignored so many red flags. Politicians called for stricter oversight on mergers. Regulators announced they were launching not just an inquiry, but a full investigation into Harmonix's past deals. Through it all, I said nothing. No interviews. No statements. Just silence. That weekend, Andrea and I drove north, away from the noise. We rented a small cabin by the lake. She asked if I was ready to let go now. I told her I was close. Cole was gone, Harmonix was bleeding, and the truth was out. But closure doesn't come from watching others fall. It comes from knowing you didn't let them bury you. As I stared at the still water that evening, I thought back to the night I first read that email. You are no longer needed. 3 weeks later, the billion-dollar merger collapsed. Now, months later, the truth was dismantling everything Cole had built. And I hadn't raised my voice once. The fallout was bigger than I imagined. By Monday morning, Harmonix Capital wasn't just under investigation, it was under siege. Regulators swarmed the firm's headquarters. Journalists camped on the sidewalk, cameras flashing every time an executive tried to sneak out a side door. Investors, once silent partners, now demanded explanations in open letters. The firm's name had become synonymous with negligence. I read every article with the same calm detachment I had kept since the beginning. My fingerprints were everywhere in those documents, but no one could prove it. That was the beauty of silence. It left no trail, only results. Inside the firm, panic hollowed them out. A friend still in accounting told me that entire departments were frozen, unsure what they were allowed to say. Karen Ellis, the interim CEO, tried to reassure employees, but her voice couldn't steady the ship. Morale collapsed alongside the share price. On Wednesday, Cole finally reappeared. Not in a boardroom, not on television, but in photographs outside a courthouse. The man who once walked with a predator's confidence now looked hunted. His lawyers flanked him, their faces hard, their words clipped. He said nothing to reporters, and for once, the silence wasn't power. It was defeat. That night, Andrea sat across from me at dinner. She said I looked different, lighter somehow. I realized she was right. For the first time in months, I felt the weight lifting. The battle was almost finished. Not because I had destroyed them with fire, but because I had let the truth do the work for me. By Friday, the healthcare partner held its own press conference. Their CEO, calm and deliberate, explained why they had walked away. Undisclosed liabilities, he said. Unacceptable risks. His words cut through the market like a blade. Harmonix stock collapsed another 20% before trading was halted. The billion-dollar dream was officially dead, sealed not by rumor or speculation, but by undeniable fact. And still, I said nothing. I didn't need to. The silence I had chosen weeks ago had grown into an avalanche. Over the weekend, I packed up the files in my study. I placed each folder back into storage, locking them away. Andrea asked if I was finally finished. I told her almost. Because while Harmonix was collapsing and Cole was cornered, I knew the board would try to rebuild. And when they did, they would spin the story. They would say they acted decisively, that they cut out the rot. They would try to bury the truth again. I wasn't going to let that happen. There was one final move left. One last act of silence that would ensure they could never rewrite what had happened. The story of Harmonix's collapse was nearly complete, but I was going to decide how it ended. The final move was simple, but it would echo louder than any courtroom verdict. On Monday morning, I scheduled a release. Not to journalists, not to regulators, but to the public. A quiet drop into the bloodstream of the internet. At 9 a.m., thousands of people received a link. It wasn't flashy. No commentary. Just a repository of documents, emails, compliance notes, draft contracts. Every warning I had raised. Every red flag Harmonix had ignored. Proof that Richard Cole and his board had chosen greed over caution, arrogance over truth. The reaction was immediate. Financial news sites scrambled to verify, but the documents were too clean, too detailed to dismiss. Social media exploded with excerpts. Employees recognized their own messages. Regulators recognized their own warnings. Investors realized they had been lied to for years. By noon, Harmonix was no longer just a firm in crisis. It was a scandal. Reporters crowded the steps of the building, shouting questions at Ellis, who had nothing left to say. The board tried to frame it as historical oversights, but the weight of evidence crushed their spin. I didn't watch the coverage live. Instead, I took Andrea for a drive upstate. The leaves had begun to turn, the air crisp with autumn. She asked if this was really the end. I told her yes. Not because Harmonix had collapsed, not because Cole was ruined, but because the truth could no longer be buried. That night, sitting by the fire in the cabin we had rented, I thought back to the first email. 10 words meant to erase me. You are no longer needed. Effective immediately. I remembered how calm I felt replying with 2 words. I understand. They thought I meant acceptance. They thought I would disappear. But silence doesn't mean surrender. Silence is space to move unseen, to prepare, to strike without warning. Silence is the weapon no one expects. 3 weeks after they fired me, the billion-dollar merger collapsed. Months later, the firm itself followed. Executives fled, reputations shattered, fortunes erased. The empire they built on arrogance and deceit fell without me ever raising my voice. Some people fight back with rage. Some fight with noise. I fought with silence. I watched, I waited, and I let their own greed drag them under. When history remembers Harmonix, it won't remember my name. It will remember the collapse, the deal that died in front of everyone, the silence that gutted an empire. And I wouldn't want it any other way. Real men don't explode. They exit. Subscribe for more power stories.